In Conversation with Scottish Attachment in Action. In this episode, Fiona Lettice, development worker at Scottish Attachment in Action and an adoptive mum, and Helen Minnis, Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Institute of Health and Wellbeing in the University of Glasgow, are in conversation about comfort and joy. Why do some foster, kin or adopted children have difficulty in accepting comfort or experiencing joy? Fiona and Helen explore how concepts such as the mistrusting brain, indiscriminate friendliness, stranger anxiety, and therapeutic play help us understand behaviour and improve outcomes for care experienced children and their families.
Last time we met, we were discussing the idea of comfort and joy, children accepting comfort and joy, and I think that was on the back of the DDP conference last year, where Professor Coleman Tritharwan and Dan Hughes were talking about that as well. And we started to think about children who are unable to accept comfort from their caregivers because of possibly adverse childhood experiences. So I wondered what you thought about that view.
I think it's probably one of the most significant problems of children, that particularly children that have been neglected or abused. So, if their early experience was that when they needed comfort, they didn't get it, then I suspect that what can happen is habitually they stop seeking it. And it's interesting, actually, I was chatting to a good friend of mine, Susanna McRae, who's a clinical nurse specialist, and she's worked for about 16, 17 years with children who've been neglected and abused, and she was saying for her that's the most important symptom, actually. It's children who don't seek comfort. And I don't think it's that they're being awkward or controlling, it's that they actually don't know that that's what parents are for.
So if we're thinking, can you give us some examples of adverse childhood experiences? And I'm thinking about a few years ago we did a study of adopted children, and what came out was not just the adverse childhood experiences, but also the other range of difficulties they had.
Yeah, well, exactly, and I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently is that children who've had adverse childhood experiences are also more likely to come into the world, to be born into the world with problems. They don't all, but we did a study recently. We did a study together, didn't we, a few years ago with children who were adopted, and found that many of them had complex overlapping neurodevelopmental problems. So some of them had attachment disorders, but also had ADHD or autism or anxiety. And I was just really struck by the complexity of some of the problems that some of the children did. This was still a minority of adopted children, but some of them really had quite a high level of complexity. And so we did a study very recently, it just was published last month, in the JCPP with a group in Sweden, and we looked in a big twin study because I really wanted to know, was this just a hunch of mine or was it really true? And we found that children who'd been maltreated were more likely than children who hadn't been maltreated to have more than one neurodevelopmental problem. And actually, children who'd been maltreated children who had 3 or more neurodevelopmental problems, so things like ADHD, learning disabilities and autism, if they had 3 or more, they were 10 times as likely to have been maltreated.
Wow.
But we found that it wasn't the maltreatment that caused that. There was something else that caused both the complexity and the maltreatment. We don't know what that is, but I mean, I can't help wondering whether it might be that these children were really, really hard to look after and that their birth families were struggling in other ways. Maybe they had neurodevelopmental problems themselves. And so it was those children who were a handful that ended up being maltreated. Not through any fault of their own, of course. No child should ever be maltreated, but it's accepting that children with neurodevelopmental problems are probably more of a handful in the first place.
That's interesting stuff.
It's kind of controversial in a way, isn't it? But I think it's really important because I think we need to recognise that all parents, including adoptive parents, are going to struggle if children have got significant problems. So I mean, if you've got a child who's highly, highly hyperactive and who doesn't sleep, and is always in your face because they're really impulsive and is rushing into the road without thinking, and you're having to supervise them more, that is going to make you stressed as a parent. You can be the best parent in the world, and that's going to make you stressed.
So the children we're talking about, some of them may still be living with their birth parents. Some could be in a foster placement. They could be in a kinship care placement. They could be adopted, as you said, or they could actually be in residential care. Yeah. So this poses it's very difficult for any of these carers looking after these children, really perhaps to get a handle on how best to help them.
I think that's right. And it's interesting because I remember you saying to me, Fiona, why do adoptive parents get blamed? And I think that's one of the reasons why, that some adoptive parents have got a really big burden in terms of how difficult it is to look after this particular child. And of course, it's not just adoptive parents. You could be in a situation where a child's with a grandparent who's, the older generation and maybe not as able to get down on the floor and play with the child, and then you've got a child who also has sort of additional needs.
And we're also talking about children who arrive in a hurry. It's not like having a birth child, is it? That unless you have twins or triplets, you have them one at a time. You've got 9 months. Although you might have been waiting to become an adoptive parent or foster parent and so on, these children might arrive. Certainly foster parents talk about children arriving in the middle of the night.
On a Friday, usually?
Yes, something's broken down. Or adoptive parents, suddenly from perhaps never parenting before, you might have 2 or 3 siblings placed together. And those siblings, quite often you hear, haven't lived together before they've come into an adoptive placement.
That's right, and you're all trying to get used to one another. And I mean, you think of your boys, and we've got children of vaguely similar ages, and you've had years to get to know their foibles. But there will have been a day when you, as an adoptive parent, suddenly had these boys and had to get to know them straight away before bed that night. Really.
And I think sometimes, because of the, quite rightly so, there has to be a very thorough, quite an intrusive assessment of carers who are going to look after other people who have been other people's children. And that's rightly so, they should be assessed properly. But you're almost, then how difficult is it to go back and ask for help if you are having problems in a placement? It's much easier to go back and ask for sort of physical medical problems. You'd be charged if a child broke their arm and you didn't have them seen to. But people struggle to go back and perhaps might see themselves as being a failure if there are emotional problems. And I still think that prevails.
I think that's right. And I suppose I'd be interested to know from your perspective as an adoptive parent, Fiona, what's it like to have children coming into your life who don't yet know that they're supposed to go to you for the problems and to comfort them?
It was very difficult. Very difficult that they didn't seek you for comfort. But what do we mean by comfort? It's not just actually coming and having a cuddle and so on. It's children who won't let you help with their homework. Children who say they can swim and jump into a pool they've never been in water before.
Oh my goodness!
And having known lots of adoptive parents and foster parents and so on, the actual not being able to accept comfort is really, it's disheartening. If you've been chosen because you've got empathy, that you can provide love, stability and kindness, to have people reject that, small people reject that, is very, very difficult.
And I get the sense from families I've worked with that sometimes that rejection can be so subtle that nobody else can see it but you.
Or they'll go to other people. They'll go to complete strangers. I remember when we first had our boys, we took them to the beach and they sat with another family.
Nightmare.
No, there might be in the other family had better sandwiches. But they just didn't know what to do. And they didn't know how you used families or how you used adults. And I think it's, when again from the DDB conference we had Dan Hughes and John Baling talking about the mistrusting brain. So children who've learned in their from being in the womb onwards, that adults aren't safe people to be around. So their sort of prism on the world is completely different from people from young children who've had good, safe, nurturing relationships.
And I wonder, I mean, this is completely my own hunch, but I wonder if there are two types of mistrusting brains. So there's one type of child who just has had a really negative experience of adults and who just really thinks the adult world is really not going to be much use to them. And they're the children who just don't seek comfort. And then there's the children, these are the kind of children that I saw when I worked in the orphanage in Guatemala, who just had a constantly changing group of caregivers. So it wasn't that they didn't trust adults in general, it was just that one was as good as the other. They'd never had a really positive experience of intimacy, real intimacy. You know, the postman would be just as good to go for problem solving as the person that you've been told is to be your new mum.
And quite often, sometimes in children who go on to be taken into care, they've perhaps been in birth families who they've been looked after by a number of people. So, you know, there might have been older siblings looking after them, there might have been cousins and so on, so they've been passed around. But sometimes that can happen once they first go into care, because sometimes children are in foster care places with lots of children and they're picked up and moved around and so on. So again, there's that contradiction when children go into an adoptive placement, and they're expected, the adoptive parents are wanting to parent them, but it's almost too much for these children as well. At the same time, you're almost forcing intimacy that they can't actually accept.
I mean, I think intimacy is the key word, because one of the things I really noticed from having worked in that orphanage all those years ago, so that would be 1992. I could never understand why I was both the nurse and the doctor. So that if I prescribed amoxicillin, say, for Diego, the only way I could get it given to Diego was if I gave it myself, because the staff who looked after the children, they just were not, the way they were managed, they weren't supposed to pick Diego out. So if I prescribed it for everybody in the orphanage, they would have all got it. And I think that's the analogy is with big extended families where nobody's getting intimacy. That's a problem. Whereas if you get a big extended family where actually all the adults are really looking out for a particular child and discriminating between children, then the more the merrier in a sense. So I think if, for example, Nelson Mandela grew up in a polygamous family and he had all these mothers, apparently he had something like 7 mothers, but you can bet they were all looking out for Nelson.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Whereas if you're in a situation where the parents' minds are off on some other thing, like getting their next, bag of heroin, and they're really not, none of these adults are really able to plug into the children, then that's when it's a problem, I think.
And also the children when the parents are sometimes emotionally available, and when they're perhaps not misusing alcohol or whatever, but sometimes they are. So those children are very tricky, because they push me, pull you, aren't they? They want you, but they don't want you, because that's how they experience caregivers as well. So they again are very tricky children to look after, and they're exhausting children to look after, because you never get it right.
Or they'll up the ante, because they know that, they know that one way of getting care from an adult that's only sometimes there is to make a lot of noise about it.
How does that fit in with the indiscriminate friendliness that you quite often talk about?
I think my hunch is that indiscriminate friendliness comes much more for just never having had any kind of intimacy. Any reasonable quality attachment would protect you against indiscriminate friendliness. So even if it's a disorganised attachment, if somebody's actually looking out for you even some of the time in a kind of really one-to-one intimate way, then that's probably going to protect you. And I sometimes really wonder, John Bowlby told us that, it's a normal developmental step at the age of kind of 6 to 9 months to develop stranger anxiety, so that, you want to stick towards your own family and your own group of intimate adults. And that was to do with, we're herd animals and you don't want to be picked off from the herd by the hyena. And so I was always really perplexed by these indiscriminate friendly children, because, they don't have that protective instinct to stick close to the herd. But I guess the thing is, they don't actually have a herd.
That's true.
So unfortunately, any adult, in their mind, any adult will do. I was thinking that film Lion that's just come out, I mean, just in case you don't know the story, it's about a wee boy who at the age of 5 ends up on a train, and he falls asleep on a train and wakes up 1,600 miles away and gets lost, really lost, and he doesn't find his family for 25 years. But he, at the age of 5, was on the streets of Calcutta, and you see that there were a couple of situations that he had an instinct were dangerous, and he ran. And I was really struck by that, and I thought, I wonder why he wasn't like some of the other children and didn't go off with these horrible gangs that abuse street children. And I wondered if it's because he wasn't indiscriminately friendly. So he'd actually been brought up in a very poor, very materially poor but loving family, and so he wasn't indiscriminately friendly. So he actually had the social nous to work out the difference between safe adults and unsafe adults.
And before we started talking, we spoke a little bit about siblings in family groups that are placed for foster, adoption, kinship care, but they've all had their own individual experience. So cut and pasting children's histories is not a good idea.
That's right.
So you could have older children who had an older sibling who actually parented in some way, in a good way, or the parents' relationship was better, or people weren't using substances quite so much.
Yeah.
So that sort of flies in the face of people who say the younger that you get a child, the better.
Yeah.
What do you think
Exactly.
of that?
I would absolutely agree. And I think also children can differ in families according to their temperament. You know, my children are both, you know, genetically related to me, and they're so different from one another temperamentally. One is very feisty and in your face, and the other one's chill. And I think children's temperament, the kind of hand of cards they come into the world with, so much interacts with their environment. And as you say, their environment can change according to how old they are. I remember, so the geneticists, the behavioural geneticists talk about non-shared environment, and I really struggled to get my head around that. And the way I explained it to myself was, imagine you've got a 9-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl in a family, and the father suddenly becomes unemployed. If the 2-year-old girl is spending most of her time at home with mum, she's probably not going to particularly notice. But if the 9-year-old boy is already starting to be asked, what are you going to do when you grow up? And suddenly your dad's unemployed, that could have a really profound effect. So it's the same event, same family, and a completely different effect on the child. And then, of course, if you've got different temperaments, if you had a very anxious 9-year-old boy and a very chill 2-year-old girl, again, you could have a child with major problems from the same event compared to one that has none.
So going back to what you were saying earlier about perhaps the complexity of some of these children who've had, might have all sorts of difficulties as well as adverse childhood experiences, and parents going to CAMHS and asking for help. Sometimes the parents themselves
Look
frazzled, traumatised, and professionals sometimes say, why are these people being allowed to either be kinship carers, foster carers or adopters?
I think
Have you experienced that?
Absolutely. Some of the families in the study that you collaborated with us on a few years ago had children that had such difficult behaviours that our research assistants had migraines at the end of the day. And these children were going home to live 24/7 with parents who had to deal with these behaviours on a daily basis and who loved these children and were trying to do the best. But, you know, if you're sleep deprived and exhausted, it's very difficult. And I can imagine myself, you know, if I had a child with a list of symptoms as long as your arm, and you're exhausted and frazzled, I can imagine I would probably sound a little shrill when I went to CAMHS. And I think that, I do think sometimes, unfortunately, there's an assumption that somehow there must be a problem with the parent. When in fact, often what's happening is these children's problems are being really buffered in a way that, you know, if they'd been in a different family, everybody would have been shouting about the child's problems. But actually often the adoptive parents are such good parents that they're actually helping this child manage because they're taking all of the strain.
The danger with that sometimes is that the intimacy that we talked about earlier, about and how to develop that with children who come to you not at birth, that's hindered if you're having to manage very difficult behaviours all the time.
Absolutely.
And I think that's sometimes missed by CAMS as well.
I think that's right, and I think any parent who's having to manage really difficult behaviours, any parent, kinship, adoptive, foster, birth parent, whatever, they need additional support. And I think that's a message that we just haven't absorbed, I think, is that the level of support needed by parents does, to a certain extent, vary according to the child.
And there's a mismatch, isn't there? We've got children who've been taken into care. Usually, there are some relinquished children, but mainly they're taken into care because of difficulties and so on, and they will have been given a service at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yet when they're placed into permanent placements, whichever way, through adoption, kinship care, foster care, sometimes those services disappear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we go back to the old adage that somehow love is going to be enough for these children.
Right. That's right. And I think, again, that's another symptom of, a lack of recognition that some children do have significant problems.
What do you think about early intervention? Because in my view, especially when we're talking children who have had disrupted attachments, who struggle with intimacy, the benefits of actually being able to have therapeutic play, having proper life story work, holding parents emotionally and psychologically safely so they can help their children know their story and develop it with them over the years. I often think that if we did that as a matter of course for all these children, would we have the same number of children that had big problems when they moved to secondary school,
absolutely.
or end up in the prison population?
I couldn't agree with you more, Fiona. I think about this more and more, and I sometimes kind of picture it in my mind almost like a fulcrum, because there's this term that's being bandied about recently, and someone needs to think of one that rolls off the tongue a bit better, but this idea of differential susceptibility. And it's this idea that children with different temperaments are more or less susceptible to the environment. And so we know now that if you have children with easy, in inverted commas, temperaments, they will be resilient to almost any environment. But children who are feisty and who don't have kind of easy biological rhythms and are overactive and these kind of jangly problems, they can do better than the general population if they get the right parenting at the right time. And it only has to be good enough. It doesn't have to be brilliant. But in order to get good enough parenting, the parents need to be supported with these children. And I think of my own kids. I mean, my older daughter, my daughter, she's 20 now. She was a handful. But we were lucky. We had, there were two of us, two parents. We had grandparents near. We had enough money. We had a car. But she was still a handful, but she didn't send us over the edge. And I just think that adoptive families often do have those kinds of resources, but often they need that additional bit of support because the child then often has additional problems of not knowing to go for comfort. And often I think if you can get in there early enough and do the kind of intervention, I think of things like video interaction guidance, where you can just do really detailed work on helping parents to go that little extra mile to plug into the child, then sometimes these children don't just thrive, they really flourish.
And I think if you are a parent who's frazzled and might have secondary trauma from living with the child's trauma and absorbed all that, then you miss the good bits as well. So I know we got some great support from CAMS, and it was very small things, like my youngest son was recording Waterloo Road for me when I was away from the house, because it's something we shared together. That was a huge thing, but I would probably have missed that because of all the other stuff going on. And recently, our oldest boy, who was care experienced till he came to us at 5.5, was telling us about, he came home one day and there was something on the news, and he said, I'd hate it if the house burnt down. And I said, well, I think that's a given. He said, but my room would be gone. And I said, yes. And save us tied, I was a bit flip about it. And he actually said, you've got no idea the comfort I had from having my own room. And he's doing art, and then he's now doing a project or working on something about prisons and prisoners having their own space, their own pod in prison, that then they would take out when they came out of prison, so the transition would be easier for him. But he was definitely, and I thought the word comfort was not a usual word for a 23-year-old. I didn't think so anyway. But I was moved by that. If you've been in transition and not had control in and out of care, to suddenly be somewhere that you knew you'd be staying.
Yes.
It was your own space, how important that is.
I think that's right, and I think what we often miss is that sometimes all you need are really small tweaks, things that we would think were ordinary, but they're so crucial. And I think that's because children have a really strong instinct towards attachment, and parents, including adoptive parents, all kinds of parents and carers, have a really strong instinct towards caregiving. But barriers get put up in the way, and sometimes if you can remove those barriers, everything just works. Your example there just makes me think of a lovely clinical example that I heard recently. We're actually going to write this up as a case report, but obviously I'm not going to breach confidentiality. But a boy that had been in foster care for years and had a real problem with failing to seek comfort, just not plugging into the family, and did a couple of sessions with a psychotherapist, where an absolutely brilliant psychotherapist, I have to say, who encouraged this young person to actually try and elicit more care from the foster carer, and tried to encourage the foster carer to notice when this boy wasn't really signalling his needs. Saw them twice and doesn't think he needs to see them again because all they needed was a little tweak. They just needed to just go that slight extra mile, and then everything else clicked into place. And there were all sorts of reasons why they hadn't been doing that. And I think if their relationship had been differently supported by the systems, they might have got that earlier.
And I see that. You see, it's not universal throughout Scotland, but there's examples of interventions, of therapeutic interventions right at the beginning of placements, so that the parents and children are tuned into and can deepen that intimacy and begin to make good of things that have been not so good in the past.
Exactly. I mean, I think of what Mary Dozier talks about. I love her term, which is gentle challenge. And I know Dan Hughes has used that in his work as well. And it's just this idea, I mean, it's not rocket science, but if you've got a child that's not been used to seeking care, then you can't just be sensitive, because sensitive parenting is where you sit back and you're led by the child. But if the child's not, there's this lovely term, serve and return, and children are supposed to do the serving. But if the children never serve, then there's nothing to return. So what the parent then has to do is to start serving. But they've got to do it gently, because if they don't, the child will reject them. So it's a bit like being I think in some ways it's a bit like being a child whisperer, just very gently kind of warming the child up.
That's a nice term.
It's quite a nice term, isn't it?
I think we could leave it on that.
We could.
Child whisperer. Thanks, Helen.
I think you've obviously been that, Fiona.